Heading south of the Mason-Dixon, this is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Welcome back to the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. This is your host, Brian McClanahan, and this is episode 158, covering the week of February 18th through February 22nd, 2019. Glad to have you back on the program. Very glad to be here. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at Abbeville Institute, like our Facebook page at Abbeville Institute, and of course, subscribe to our YouTube page at Abbeville Institute. On that YouTube page, we also have this podcast, which we upload, but we do have lectures and other materials that you can watch, again, free of charge. Also, don't forget that we exist on your generous contributions alone. So if you like this podcast, if you like our website, if you like our conferences and programs, please consider a tax-deductible donation to the Abbeville Institute. You can find all the information for that by going to abbevilleinstitute.org. At the top of the page, you'll see a button that says support. Click on that, and you'll see donor options, and you'll have our annual, monthly, or one-time giving options. And while you're there at abbevilleinstitute.org, don't forget to give us an email address, and we'll give you a free ebook. And you'll get our Daily Dose of Dixie Monday through Friday and our weekly email on Saturday or Sunday, which includes a link to this podcast. Also, don't forget to download our free mobile application. You can get it on your favorite mobile app store. Again, free of charge. It is a mobile link to this podcast, to our lectures, and to our website. So all of that is there. And if you want your Abbeville Institute apparel, go to abbevilleinstitute.org. At the top of the page, again, you'll see that support button. You'll see a button under that, a tab that says shop. Click on that. You can get all your Abbeville Institute apparel, embroidered apparel. It's nice stuff, hats, shirts, fleece, polo shirts, all kinds of cool things. So get your Abbeville Institute apparel. They are high quality, and they will last. And as also, we've done a series on Albert Taylor Bledsoe's Davis a Trader online. These are Jefferson seminars that we've done free of charge online through YouTube. It is through my personal account, but we're migrating them over to the Abbeville Institute YouTube page. But we're going to do more of these. So if you like those things, again, your donations will help do that. I think we're going to have one coming up in April on music featuring Dr. Tom Daniel, who did a fantastic presentation, or two of them, at our summer school. So highly recommend when that comes up, you sign up for those. Again, free of charge, but it's a great way to see what we're doing at the Institute and see the kind of materials that we present. And they are a smashing success. We have Part 5. It was supposed to be a 4-part series, but Part 4 had some technical difficulties. So we have Part 5 this Tuesday, 8 p.m. Eastern Time. All you have to do is go to our Facebook page. There's a link to it. I'll send out an email about it. So all you got to do is get on that way. If you're on our social media, you'll see it. The link is there. You click on that. You say you're going to go. You just follow the link, and again, it's free of charge. Great way to keep in touch with the Institute. Okay, so let's talk about the week that was at the Institute. We had a lot of interesting material this week. Seemingly, all the material didn't really mesh together well, but it all has a theme. And one of those themes is, I think the major theme for these particular pieces is the changing political nature of the South and what happened in the South, particularly in the post-war period, in the post-bellum period. We spent a lot of time talking about the antebellum South, but the post-war South, I think in many ways, is just as interesting and perhaps more important than the antebellum South. We talk about the Southern tradition and what that Southern tradition means, but at the end of the day, that Southern tradition is only as good as the people that are going to adhere to it once the war is over and things are changing in the South. And so we had the seminal work, I'll Take My Stand, written in the 1920s, published in 1930 by the 12 Southerners. And again, this is a critique of the modern South from an old South tradition. And a lot of those individuals went on to write great works of fiction, great histories, but we don't often talk about Southern politics in that particular way. And we had two very interesting pieces on that this week, one on Monday and one on Thursday. The piece on Monday, written by John Devaney, gets into this notion of the Southern tradition. And the title of the piece is Contested Ground, Southern Identity and the Southern Tradition. And the contested ground, of course, is the 20th century South. Because essentially what will happen is that people will say the South is only the South because of its unification on the issue of race. And this is a big topic. It's something that people have to wrestle with all the time. I mean, how true is that? Was the Solid South only the Solid South because of things like slavery or segregation, Jim Crow, whatever the case may be? Is that the only reason the South was the Solid South? And certainly if you read people like Drew Gilpin Faust or Dan Carter, you're going to get the impression that's the case, right? Dan Carter's Politics of Rage is one of the books that people like to cite. You got to go out and read that because that shows you that the entire South is just unified on this one issue, and that's it. It was that issue and that issue alone. And then you read Drew Gilpin Faust or Confederate Nationalism. The only thing that unified the South together in the 1850s and 60s was this issue of race-based slavery. Outside of that, the South was never really that interested in a unified voice. And so these are very powerful arguments. And of course, they go through and they cherry-pick things to make their argument and make it seem like this is true. And certainly the South was unified, for the most part, on these particular issues. There's no doubt about it. But was there something deeper to it in the Southern tradition, something that we can actually use in the 21st century, some parts of the Southern tradition that we can point to and say, you know what, there's something else to this? And I think this is why this piece by John Devaney is so good, because what he does essentially is point out the Neo-Puritan destruction of the South, and of course the war being one of the turning points. And he does this in a way that I think points the fingers at people who just simply wanted to get over the compromise. You see, after the war was over, there was a compromise. We're going to have a South, we're going to have a North, we're all just going to get along. You do your thing in the North, we do our thing in the South. And that was reconciliation. Now, people again will say, well, it's all about race. It wasn't all about race. There was an identity to being in the South, and it had more to do with than race. I mean, race was a given, North and South, because the North wasn't really interested in solving any type of race relations. The North was not interested in a more egalitarian racial society at all. So that was just simply a given. People that run around saying, well, Confederate statues were put up to perpetuate Jim Crow, don't really know what they're talking about. I mean, nobody had to perpetuate Jim Crow. It was already a given. That wasn't even a question in the South for much of Southern history. That wasn't even an issue. Now you say, well, but Reconstruction. The fact is, the ascendancy of the Democrats after Reconstruction and then the society that created, I mean, it was a given as to what things were going to be. There was no reason to put anything in anyone's face because it was just accepted. It was the way it was. There was very little resistance to it at that point. So why would you even worry about that? What happened, of course, is that these statues are going up to honor the soldiers 25, 50, 75 years, whatever the case may be, after the war was over, because you started seeing people die out. And they're trying to put up monuments to these people that fought and died in the war. The brothers, fathers, uncles, cousins, all these people that had fought and died in the war. That's the point of these statues. And the dominant group in the South, and because 75% of white Southerners had fought in the war, were those who had been part of the Confederate cause. So that's going to be something they're going to do. I mean, this is ridiculous, but to assert otherwise. So John Devaney calls this the Great Compromise. And he says it begins to crack in the 1920s with the infamous Scopes monkey trial. In a piece, this is quote, in a piece published by the New York Evening Mail in 1917, H.L. Mencken, the acerbic columnist for the Baltimore Sun, portrayed the South in his essay, The Sahara of the Beaux-Arts, as a benighted land, sterile as a desert, given the absence of any sort of intellectual or artistic life. Mencken continued the assault through the 1920s. When Southerners responded to Mencken and other critics of the South, for example, the Southern agrarians, charges were hurled back at the South's heightened sensitivity to well-deserved criticism. The true Achilles heel of the South was not Southern culture per se, but rather the practice of Jim Crow. True, Jim Crow was nothing more than the codification of informal Northern practices of racial segregation. but the restriction of tax-paying members of the community to separate public facilities was grating on any sense of fairness or justice. Contrary to the decision of Plessy v. Ferguson, the separate facilities of blacks and whites were not equal by any real measure of equality or quantity. If the NAACP had chosen to attack Jim Crow on these grounds, it is doubtful that Southern states would have been able to afford the necessary upgrades to African American public facilities to meet the test set down by the decision in Plessy. As a result, integration may have occurred under very different circumstances. Instead, then, the NAACP and other civil rights organizations chose to attack segregation on the grounds of ideology, where a bigoted South must be brought to embrace the primary American principle of equality by any and all means. The narrative of the civil rights movement became one in which a second reconstruction of the South was justified so that the principle of equality might vanquish the dark forces of racism and bigotry. So this is true. The economic attack on Jim Crow would have been sufficient. It would have crippled the entire institution, and it would have been justified because, as anyone knows who looked at these things, the facilities were not separate and equal. They weren't at all. They weren't equal in any scope of the imagination. Now, that would have been something that would have been a successful, as John Devaney says, a successful attack on these particular institutions. But they chose the ideological attack, and that is part of what I often call the neo-con. You see, it's the idea of the Republican Party swooping in to save the day because the Republican Party has always been the party of Lincoln. And so he continues. Even though the reign of Jim Crow came to an end in the South, and generally a much more peaceful end than in many northern states, the demonization of the South was only beginning. As the more socially and religiously conservative region of the Union, the South came under regular attacks for its commitment to school prayer and public religious displays, for the defense of the traditional form of marriage, and for any display of Confederate symbols or any sorts of public honors paid to Confederate heroes. These attacks on Southern tradition and culture revealed a good deal more about the second generation of Reconstructionists than they did about the shortcomings of the South. Many of these new Reconstructionists were the inheritors of a secular Puritan legacy and the disciples of cultural Marxism who began to dominate the academy in the 1960s. So again, it's that ideology. See, what you're seeing today is not really a concern over, it's a statue, right? A statue does nothing, but it's ideologically grating on the cultural Marxists who have to say we have to be one culture, and that culture is their culture. They're not interested in diversity. What they want is their culture to dominate, this neo-Puritan legacy. And he continues, the ideological legacy of the Northern victory in the war between the states was a triumph of a secularized Puritan ideology. This ideology viewed the United States as a nation with a special destiny and history to create a secular city upon the hill which all nations would continue to emulate. Robert Penn Warren observed that the war between the states had conferred upon the South the myth of the great alibi, by which all the region's shortcomings could be laid at the foot of the war. Meanwhile, the Northerner, with his treasury of virtue, feels redeemed by history, automatically redeemed. He has an indulgence, a plenary indulgence, for all sins past, present, and future, freely given by the hand of history. This plenary indulgence meant that the left and other enemies of the South would never be content with mere cultural hegemony. Rather, they wished everyone to think exactly as they did. So he says when you put this together with cultural Marxism, that creates a monster that cannot be tamed. And that's exactly what we're seeing now. So in talking about what's true and valuable in the Southern tradition, this is what Southerners are facing. You see, it's a complete destruction of Southern tradition. That's important. Because that Southern tradition, as people point out, they slip up every now and then. They say it. I remember there was a piece written about the state song of Maryland. And the author of that particular piece, which I responded to, said that the song was an act of defiance. You see, this is what the South represents more than anything else. It's an act of defiance. It's something that says to the North or to the West or whatever dominant culture, the Midwest, we don't like you and we're not going to change. And that to the Neo-Puritan, that can't happen. You can't do that. You can't say you're not going to change. We will then force you to change. It is cultural imperialism at the highest level. And Devaney continues, in this matter, many Southerners were only happy to oblige their moral betters. Thus emerged the self-loathing leftist Southerner who was all too willing to believe and identify with any negative stereotype hurled at the Southerners. If this meant that the Great Compromise would be repealed, so be it. If this meant accepting the neo-abolitionists and new left narratives concerning the Civil War, then so be it. If this meant the destruction of Confederate monuments, then so be it. Indeed, if this meant the reconstruction of all Southern memory, meaning, and tradition, antebellum, bellum, and postbellum, then so be it. These folks became the good Southerner, the equivalent of the good Indian. The plight of both is similar. No matter how high both rise on the ladder of civilization, no matter how obsequious each is to their masters, they both remain the unredeemed children of the wilderness. The good Southerner may certainly profit by adopting the values and worldview of the enemy of his region, but the payment received for this is the distortion of his history, his culture, and his identity. What is most pathetic and sinister about this situation is the welcome he extends to his own alienation from his true identity and history. Indeed, he views his alienation as a sign of redemption. He no longer remembers who he is and is happy for it. When he meets non-Southerners or travels outside the region and is asked if he plans to marry his first cousins, he is incapable of even recognizing the attack upon the honor of himself and his people, for he has no honor left. Instead, he embraces the bigotry of his moral superiors, which is the last politically correct prejudice. That is a beautiful paragraph because it encapsulates what we're dealing with here in the modern world and why we exist at the Abbeville Institute. Because we don't want you to be ashamed of these things. They're there. Every civilization has thorns. Every civilization has them. But the rose of Southern civilization, this is why I've said on this podcast for 3 years now, the South is America. What we think of America was Southern. It's that Jeffersonian position. Even Lincoln, okay, if you just want to say, well, we live in a Lincolnian America now. Even Lincoln was born in the South. In fact, there was an essay we published years ago on the fact that the South wouldn't have lost the war without the South. That the great generals of the North and even the leaders of the North, many of them were actually Southern. The South wouldn't have lost the war without the South. So it is the South that is America, this Jeffersonian tradition. Those that try to put Lincoln with Jefferson, what they're saying is, well, we haven't really lost the Jeffersonian tradition. Well, we did. I mean, Lincoln was something else. He was a nationalist, and which Jefferson was not. So we have this very interesting situation going on now. And again, why we exist at the Institute is to ensure that this type of Southerner, this self-loathing Southerner, wakes up. I mean, a lot of people have. They thought, well, I mean, they come around to this and they think, wow, there's something to this. I mean, there's something to the fact that Southerners are the only group of people that can be disparaged, picked on, and it's acceptable. I mean, the only group that you can make jokes about at all times. We're running a piece next week on this, dealing with talk radio and how the attacks that are made on the South are done in a way that's they don't even seem like they're an attack, but they are. And that's because of the neocon, right? Because the neoconservatives now are coming out and saying, well, the Republicans were right in all of this. The Republican Party, great Republican Party. See, it all comes down to R&D. And I think that's where the piece on Thursday by Randall Ivey fits in search of the real Southern Democrat. Because you see, what the South has really lost is a true political expression of the South. And Randall Ivey is a lifelong Democrat. I mean, he still is a Democrat. He does not like the Republican Party. And at the end of that piece, he talks about, well, I mean, we just keep trying to work to keep these yellow dog Democrats around. People like Jim Webb and others. We try to keep these people around, but it's very difficult because the Democrat Party has moved away from what it was. One of the points I made on my own podcast, the Brian McClanahan Show, and I'm going to talk about a piece I wrote this week for the Institute as well. But one of the things I mention is that the Republican Party has never changed. It's always been the same Republican Party. What happened is the Democrat Party moved left, and then Southerners were left with nothing. And as they adopted the Republican Party, as they became Republicans, then they had to accept this treasury of virtue. Then they had to be these people that John Devaney's talking about here. That's when the South started becoming assimilated into this self-loathing Southerner. Because at that point you had to accept the Northern narrative of the war, that Reconstruction was beneficial to the South, that all these things were great, that the South was simply backwards, it needed to be redeemed, it needed to be saved from itself. There's a book, From Oligarchy to Republicanism by Forrest Neighbors. And he's a nice guy. Forrest Neighbors is nice. He teaches in Alaska. He's a nice fellow. He's in line with people on a lot of issues if you're a conservative, but he believes to his core that the South needed to be saved from itself. And it was oligarchic and it needed to be democratic. Now, we could talk about how wrong that is, how backwards that thinking actually is, that the South really was democratic. The Southern republicanism was already there, but these people don't look at it that way. But see, that's the Republican narrative from the 1850s. That is the narrative that came in the antebellum narrative, the slave power theory. And essentially all that's happening in modern society and modern historical literature in this particular way is just a regurgitation of the slave power. Forrest Neighbors might as well be Matthew Karp. Matthew Karp is a professor at Princeton who is a Calhoun basher. He might as well be Matthew Karp. He's a Marxist. Karp is a Marxist. Neighbors might as well be in line with Karp. And he would say, I don't agree with Matthew Karp, but he does. When you have Republicans coming out and saying their favorite historian is Eric Foner, that's a problem. So this is the issue that the South faces. You have pressure from both sides because of the Republican Party. And so this is what Mr. Ivey gets into in this particular piece, and all these. I mean, where is Sam Ervin? Where is Carter Glass? You had Glass-Steagall. You look at where's Richard Russell, and of course all these people. They're pointing out, well, all these people were segregationists. This is true, but there's something else to this as well. It is as Randall points out here. Randy points out. He began to consider himself a conservative Democrat in the Jeffersonian mold. It was that Jeffersonian idea of limited government, decentralization, the states having control of things, that federal compact. You can say, well, that just comes back to the other issues that we talked about. No, it's bigger than that. It's bigger than that. There's so many other issues here. And that's the problem. It's the narrative that's being formed by the neocons and of course the left that turns it all back to an issue that's going to make Southerners turn on themselves. But there's so many other things happening here. The agrarian order in the South. These things that Jefferson, look, resistance to the fusion of banking, finance, and government, which the left doesn't necessarily disagree with at all. They agree with it 100%. They want to make money. They want to go out and use the government and the finances of the government to their benefit, to the benefit of their constituents, in whatever way that might be. But it's this Jeffersonian resistance to centralization that's the key to the old Southern Democrats, and certainly in many different ways. So that's an important thing to get when you start talking about, what's happening to the South. There's no political organization for the South. There's hardly any cultural or social organizations for the South. We don't have groups that are driving the agenda anymore coming out of the South. We're letting New England dictate the agenda. And that's because we've been taught for generations now, for at least 2 generations or so, that the South has been the bad guy, the insignificant other in everything. And it hasn't always been that way, but it is now. And this has to do with how we teach presidential administrations. The piece on Tuesday, Recarving Rushmore, is a book review by the book of that same title, Recarving Rushmore, Ranking the Presidents on Peace, Prosperity, and Liberty by Ivan Ellen. One of the things I pointed out in this particular review is that Ellen, first of all, he gets the best president in American history, right, in John Tyler. He certainly was. But one of the things that Ellen will do, and it's subtle, but it's a problem with the book, and I recommend you get it because it's a worthwhile read. It's quick, it's punchy, But one of the things he does that's problematic is that he uses this framework of liberty to push an activist presidential agenda in his ideological prism. So, for example, I point out he's critical of Zachary Taylor because he didn't do enough to alleviate the shameful murder of the American Indian tribes in California. He castigates Franklin Pierce for stealing Indian land and for his slave-based foreign and domestic policies. So, should we just read Eric Foner to do that? Because this is what you're getting. These are just a couple examples, but he does this throughout the book. If the person has a position, he doesn't try to understand the administrations. Zachary Taylor, a Southerner. Franklin Pierce, often criticized for being too pro-Southern. Essentially, it's an anti-Southern book because the South, again, is the bad guy, and everything they wanted to do was bad. It's that self-loathing thing that John Devaney was getting into for the piece on Monday. That's the problem. This is the issue. And that's what, again, we're trying to confront on a daily. You can't do that. That's presentism. You can't be a presentist and be a historian. You have to take people for what they were at their time and try to understand them for that. And so that's the major flaw in the book. But he does, again, rank the presidents properly. John Tyler's great. Grover Cleveland is great. Those are interesting presidents. Martin Van Buren, who's often, people like Nathaniel Macon of North Carolina really liked Martin Van Buren. So there wasn't, he was not universally despised even at the time. And Martin Van Buren was not a guy that was hated throughout the South. Nathaniel Macon was a good constitutionalist. He was a good Jeffersonian, and he liked Martin Van Buren. He's very critical of Thomas Jefferson for several reasons, and I disagree with that. Jefferson's first term was good. His second term, not so much. But, he is critical of George Washington, for example, and that'll bridge into the piece that we have on Friday. And rightfully so, because Washington did some things wrong, but Washington still is better than Lincoln, which is, this dichotomy, Lincoln-Washington, it's often seen as not a dichotomy, but it's there. That dichotomy exists. These two individuals are starkly different. And so the email that we put out last weekend, had the piece that I wrote from that a couple of years ago on that particular issue. And you could have done that with anybody, any president for the most part with Lincoln. Lincoln was the most underprepared president in American history, even more so than Barack Obama. Now, the piece on Wednesday is an interesting piece. First of all, the piece of Randall Abbey we published, it was actually first published at Reckoning, which is a good website. So go on out there and check reckoning.com. This particular piece was published in Crisis Magazine, which of course is a traditional Catholic magazine. And it's written by Jerry Salyer, and it's about Lord Acton. Lord Acton, Confederate sympathizer. And not only was Lord Acton a Confederate sympathizer, he recognized the beauty of John C. Calhoun. He recognized that Calhoun was the, quote, real defender of the Union. He called Calhoun's position on nullification the very perfection of political truth. And Salyer says, what Acton found compelling was Calhoun's idea that in the modern age, the distinctions between monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy are less significant than the distinction between centralized regimes, which stifle communities and individuals, and decentralized regimes, which accord considerable agency to various quasi-sovereign actors. Now, Acton was anti-slavery. In fact, Acton was very critical of pro-slavery Southerners and abolitionists. He thought the abolitionists was destructive. New England Puritans, because he admired Southern culture and he thought that these Puritans were destroying a culture in many ways. And it's not just because of slavery, but what they were doing to the United States was destroying it. He said this, quote, the time has come for extinction of servitude. The same problem has sooner or later been forced on many governments, and all have bestowed on their greatest legislative skill, lest in healing the evils of a forced but certain labor, they should produce incurable evils of another kind. They attempted at least to moderate the effect of Southern unconditional change, to save whom those they despoiled from ruin, and those whom they liberated from destitution. But in the United States, no such design seems to have presided over the works of emancipation. It has been an act of war, not of statesmanship or humanity. They have treated the slave owner as an enemy and have used the slave as an instrument for his destruction. And so he's very critical of that particular process, the immediate emancipation, the way it happened. It wasn't allowed to happen as it did in the North, which was gradually over time, and that allowed for the institution to die out in a way that it couldn't in the South. And that created very real conflict when the war was over, and that's something we just don't recognize anymore. Could we done this better? Could this have happened better for the South and the United States, for both white and black Americans? Could it have been done in a better way that would have solved some of the problems that we see today in the 21st century? That's not a question that people are really willing to ask, but it's one that we should ask. We know the benefit of ending slavery is great, but how you end it is the question. That's what Lord Acton was getting into, and why he considered the war to be a cataclysmic event, a destruction of America, because of what it did to Southern statesmanship, what it did to the South as a whole, and what it did to America as a whole by destroying that culture that had produced so many great men like Washington, Jefferson, and on down the line, Madison, Monroe, Marshall. You just look at, and not just, but look at the number of Southerners who had an impact on government and what really was America. That war undid all of that. Now, of course, not every Southerner is free from critique, and even George Washington gets that, and that's the last piece. Joe Wolverton wrote a piece, A Little Whiskey Rebellion, on Friday, where it gets into Washington's move in the Whiskey Rebellion and how it was completely unconstitutional. But this was something that Hamilton wanted. Washington just listened to Hamilton. But the one thing about this particular episode is Washington tried as long as possible. You could say he could have kept trying, but he exhausted, and what his mind was, every avenue available to him to have diplomacy and solve the problem without actually marching in the troops. Lincoln didn't do that. Lincoln was not a statesman. He just marched in the troops. Forget it. We're just going in. Washington tried to do everything he could. Lincoln would not even entertain Confederate commissioners. He wouldn't even have them visit. Seward was pretending he was sick. Lincoln wouldn't visit with them because in his mind that was weakness. But that would have been real statesmanship to avoid a wider conflict, which was the great big war that killed over 700,000 people. Lincoln didn't do any of that. Lincoln wasn't a statesman. Washington was. Now, we can point to the fact that Washington's march into western Pennsylvania was unconstitutional. The governor of the state, Thomas Mifflin, didn't ask for it. John Jay, the Supreme Court Chief Justice, said it was unconstitutional. Only one justice, James Wilson, the nationalist of Pennsylvania, Supreme Court Justice, said that it was fine, that this situation in western Pennsylvania was too difficult to handle with just the ordinary legal means. We had to do something else. Only one justice did that. So, but he was a nationalist, and he hated these people in the western part of his own state. So that was bound to happen. But this is the mistake that Washington made. The other one that he doesn't talk about, this mistake that Washington made, was the Neutrality Proclamation. Presidents don't have proclamation powers. And that led to the very famous Pacificus Helvidius debates between Madison and Hamilton. Washington didn't have that power, and of course, but that creates the impression that presidents do have proclamation power. So Washington is not even without critique, and of course, that recarving Rushmore gets into that. That Washington generally also did some things that were dangerous for the future of the executive branch. But still, Washington is better than Lincoln. At least Washington was a statesman. He made some mistakes. All presidents do. But the fact is, Washington was willing to exhaust all avenues of statesmanship before doing anything that might be considered violent. And he even knew what would happen if he marched the troops in, what this could be portrayed as. So that's an important thing to understand. All right. So that's a lot of cool material for this week. We had a lot of different topics to discuss, and these are all great articles this week. So I hope you go on out and read them, and you enjoy them. And again, share them around with friends. Share this podcast around. Share our material around. That's the way we keep spreading the word and keep growing our numbers and get more and more people interested in the Southern tradition and what's valuable in it. George Washington's statesmanship certainly is valuable. George Washington as a man certainly is valuable in the Southern tradition. What he taught people about living and honor and manners and these type of things. Robert E. Lee, same way. These people are important. If we get rid of all of that, we lose a valuable part of American history. And looking around at modern American culture, we need a little of the South in it. Until next time, good day.